Hello, and welcome back to another You Call This Yoga Internet TV talk show. If you tuned in last week and were disappointed, we were disappointed too, but we had some priorities in terms of Amnon's family's health. Everyone's doing well, and we're blessed to be back on the air. In that week's time, we've also had Yoga Fest NC, coincidentally, our all-day retreat and fundraiser for You Call This Yoga, where 500 people attended an all-day experience in all forms of yoga, from the beginner to the advanced with CE. We'll announce later in our show broadcasts when our next Yoga Fest is, because I don't remember right off the top of my head, but it's next year. In that program, we brought about 36 teachers from North Carolina and the region to share their passions of yoga and wellness. Our show is also about teachers from around the country and sometimes out of the country sharing their passions about accessible yoga. Accessible yoga is a term that can bring yoga to people that may not readily have the opportunity to practice. Our organization focuses on the physically challenged and underserved. Our guest today, David Emerson, brings yoga to those that have been compromised in their life in varying degrees by trauma. We also have a special guest host today, Dr. Barbara Vosk. Barbara was on our show last month dealing with stress management. She is a clinical psychologist in Raleigh, and I'm also fortunate to be married to her. She is a 500-hour yoga teacher that also now teaches trauma-sensitive yoga in our community to the public as well as to teacher trainees. So throughout the show, Barbara will be adding to the quality of the broadcast with her perspectives. I'm going to bring on David and ask David, well, first let's bring on our co-host and share Barbara. Good morning, Barbara.
Good morning, Howie. I'm delighted to be here, especially to have a conversation with David Emerson. I took the training with him back in 2011, right after my yoga teacher training. And I think there have been a lot of developments in the trauma center world and trauma-sensitive yoga world since then. So I'm really looking forward to hearing him talk about that today.
All right. And then with no further ado, let's bring in David from Massachusetts. Good morning, David.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for having me on your show today.
Sure. It's a real thrill because whoever I mentioned that you're on the show to seems to have had some contact with you over the years. I also have a tendency to mispronounce people's names. Do you prefer to be Dave or David?
Oh, whatever's comfortable. We can go with Dave for today.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. Dave, tell us a little about your history in the path towards becoming well-versed in trauma-sensitive yoga.
Sure. Okay. So personally, I started as a social worker after college. So my orientation to this work comes from that perspective. And for me, what that meant was I worked in residential programs with teenagers, and it's really frontline social work, working with very traumatized kids. At my point in the process, this was 25 years ago or so, I never really heard the word trauma. It was mostly just troubled youth or court-involved kids, things like that. But they were definitely very traumatized kids. I did work like that for about 10 years, and at that point, I thought my next career move would be to become a therapist. So I went to school with that intention. after a year of, kind of immersing myself in that process, I realized it really wasn't the right fit for me. So in other words, this is really talk therapy,
Mm-hmm.
very psychodynamic orientation to mental health. And for me, I just couldn't figure out how to do that
Mm.
comfortably and effectively. So at the same time, I'd been developing my own, body-based practice, starting with Tai Chi and then moving into yoga. And I found that I really loved it and moved from, as I dropped out of school to become a therapist, I moved into the world of yoga teaching, really. And so I come at this whole project with that background, both, 10 years of experience and a year of academic study as a clinician, and then, but primarily as a yoga teacher. I mean, I really chose that role. And the project began to unfold in around 2002. I met Bessel van der Kolk at the trauma center here, and then we just jumped into it fully.
Mm. Well, you mentioned a trauma center. Could you share with our audience a little more about this trauma center? Because we may not really understand this particular one.
Yeah, it's really a unique institution in the world, and the director, the founder, is a person named Bessel van der Kolk, who many of your listeners and viewers may be familiar with. Really a world leader in the understanding and treatment of complex trauma,
Mm.
interrelational complex trauma. So he founded the Trauma Center 35, 40 years ago, and with the intention both of studying trauma and also treating it. So I entered into this program in 2002, 2003 with yoga. It's established here in the Boston area, and but it has a really global focus and global reach.
Mm. Interesting. And then tell us about the faculty at this facility. I was looking at your website, and there are a diverse group of people that have been connected through your program.
Well, the trauma center itself, as I mentioned, started with the intention of research and treatment, and then it's also a training institute. The yoga program is one program within the larger whole.
Mm.
And so the beauty of it, I think, for me, definitely for me, for all of us, is that we get to interact with each other all the time. So we have yoga teachers, we have psychiatrists, we have psychotherapists, we have doctoral PhD candidates who are focused on research. And the magic of it is that we all collaborate on these
Mm-hmm.
projects. And yoga teachers have just as much value to add as psychiatrists and vice versa. So one of the really interesting things over the past 15 years or so is that we've learned how to talk to each other, and learn from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, hopefully, that means that the services we provide are stronger for our clients, our patients.
Mm-hmm. So the partnership is an integral component of this
Yeah.
path.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Our show is a talk show, but it's also an interactive show. So teachers and yoga participants feel free to call in at 919-518-9773 or Skype, computers 2K voice, or the chat on the Nissan Communications page that you logged in to view the show. So we'll just direct our viewers, if you'd like, to engage this internationally acclaimed provider. I do have a question, though, because it is a show for people that are not only yoga teachers, but I would sense more non teachers.
Hmm.
What are some of the classic signs that an individual, if they were able to notice, might notice about trauma? And then how might a teacher develop a little more awareness about that?
Right. Okay, it's very complex. Just like yoga is, incredibly rich and complicated. Trauma is in many ways equally rich and complicated. And so the study of trauma is usually called trauma theory. Has a lot of nuance to it, and the most familiar framework I would say is called post-traumatic stress disorder.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a very particular framework. It's based on a certain set of symptoms. Most people that are, interacting with the healthcare system with a diagnosis, it'll be related to PTSD. However, many of the folks we work with don't have the diagnosis. So what turns out to be the most salient, the most important factors are life experience.
Mm.
And first of all, I'll just mention is the framework is called complex trauma. And what's underneath it, what that really refers to is interrelational experiences. So, children who grow up in abusive or chronically neglectful homes, people who are trapped or captive in chronically abusive relationships throughout the lifespan. It's mostly, if I were to give some shorthand, things that people do to each other. So it's a clear distinction from just symptoms to these interrelational dynamics. And there's a great trauma theorist, an expert named Judith Herman, who, to me, has framed this the clearest. And she talks about it as power dynamics. So interrelational trauma is about somebody hoarding power and manipulating somebody else, whether it's in an abusive relationship in adulthood or children that, are just kind of brought into the world, into homes that for whatever reason, the people with all the power just, they can't share the power. Their orientation is toward manipulation. And we call that, in our society, we call that physical, sexual abuse and emotional abuse and neglect. So for us, for this framework, the most important issues are experiences. Okay? Interrelational experiences. On top of that, there's a whole complicated array of symptoms that are associated with complex trauma. From self-medication, alcohol, drug abuse, various forms of self-harm, to replaying, in some cases, relationships that are very hurtful or negative, as a way of sort of moving through trauma, replaying relationships. So there's a whole array, of material on top of it. The suffering can be incredibly intense, and it's very, very serious. And that's what we built this yoga program for.
Wow. Well, that is pretty significant and very complex. I'm going to invite Barbara in to add some other comments of what she sees in the clinical psychology world that also can dovetail with her yoga teachings.
Great.
Well, I think, David, that clarity that this program was developed for those with complex PTSD is really helpful. But one of the things I've wondered about is how some of the underpinnings of your yoga program could be applied to those who might have what sometimes we in the clinical world called little t trauma as opposed to big T trauma. I mean, you're talking about folks that are really at the high end of the scale. And certainly as research in neuroscience has progressed, we're understanding more and more, and this is certainly Bessel's contribution to the field, I think, as a pioneer, is we absolutely have to get people in their bodies as part of a total healing approach. But what are your thoughts about, say, in a traditional yoga class, where, again, if we look at the statistics on trauma, you've got a handful of people probably in every class of more than 15 people who've experienced sexual abuse, for example, or physical abuse. Right. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how these teachings can be applied and delivered to the yoga teachers who might be out in the community per se, as opposed to working in a substance abuse center or a treatment center.
Right. Great. Yeah. Thanks, Barbara. I mean, yeah, the way I think about a yoga teacher, a typical yoga studio is in their class of 15, they're going to have a full range of human beings. And we can even step back from trauma frameworks and just talk about stress. I mean, there'll be people dealing with stress in those classes, chronic stress, which is really a reference to the nervous system in a sense, chronic stress, PTSD, and complex trauma. They'll all be in the room. So teaching yoga is actually an incredibly challenging thing to do because it's an embodied practice and you'll have a whole range of human people in your room. So yeah, I think for our perspective, we're dealing with relational trauma, which at its core is about power.
Yeah.
So I think of yoga teachers that tell people what to do. Put your leg
Mm-hmm.
here, raise your
Mm-hmm.
arms, take a deep breath. That is going to activate these core sort of wounds of
Yes.
interrelational trauma, and that'll be harmful for
Mm-hmm.
people with complex trauma. If it's PTSD or even chronic stress, it's more of a nervous system impact that may be the most salient at the center. So deep breathing, we know, um, is soothing to the nervous system, particularly
Yes.
exhaling. So, yoga teachers will want to be attuned to that. In other words, if you're talking about chronic stress, power dynamics in the relationship won't be as important. It's okay to say, take 3 deep breaths, and see if that helps you feel more calm. If you're talking about complex trauma and you say, take 3 deep breaths, you're all of a sudden impacting the power in the relationship. So, and that we'll lose people there.
Yeah.
We'll hurt people, basically. So with
Mm.
complex trauma, it has to be maybe take 3 deep breaths
Mm-hmm.
if you like. How does that feel to you?
Yes.
Rather than sort of a top-down kind of
Yes.
approach. So,
Yes.
like we can just see how complicated it is, right? Because the yoga teacher will have everybody in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Who are we teaching to?
Mm.
Yes, that was one of the comments after I did the 6-hour training to yoga teachers. I think they felt like, oh my gosh, what do I do now? Because
Yeah.
they were really struck by how prevalent trauma is and that awareness of the student's experience. And I think for especially experienced teachers, there was a little bit of this freezing response. I don't
Mm.
know how to speak anymore.
Yeah.
So I think it's titrating down, but it made me realize that there's more work to do with them to help them understand these dynamics. I appreciate that perspective of power being the dominant piece for the complex PTSD. That's really helpful.
Yeah, and that's Judith Herman. I mean, for me,
Mm-hmm.
she,
Yeah.
for power, she's the person that can help anybody. So any yoga teachers may want to look at Trauma and Recovery,
Recovery. Yeah. It's a great
or
book.
key book. Vanderkook, thanks for mentioning Bessel as a neuroscientist. And I totally agree that he has really led the way in terms of helping us understand neurophysiological impacts of trauma.
Yes.
So those elements are very present in the room as well, but the power is at the middle. It's right at the center.
Yeah.
Mm. Back to me. Thank you, David and Barbara. That's just starting to dig deeply into that channel, and we'll come back to that shortly. In a brief review, there's different types of trauma, whether they call it a capital T, such as PTSD, or other micro traumas that can happen throughout the day without much awareness and overt recourse. Individuals, whether you're a yoga teacher, it may be of value to be a little more mindful of the languaging that you use in your day-to-day conversations, in the sense of speaking the way you might like to be spoken to. I know that's important for me. I've had more self-induced traumas than outside-induced trauma with sports, and I have my own reactions just to my own self-induced traumas, most of them physical and sports-related. In the process, we have some pearls of wisdom that our guests have prepared. in some of my challenges in putting the show together today, we've done things a little differently, already having a co-host. Let's explore David's first pearl as we're doing our media a little differently today. Thank you, Amnon.
Hi, in this short video I thought I would explain a key concept in trauma-sensitive yoga. It's called interoception. Basically, interoception is our capacity to feel our body experience. And in trauma-sensitive yoga, it's right at the heart of what we're doing. So for example, one interoceptive practice could be, if you're sitting or standing in this moment, just notice the surface underneath you. One way to notice would be to look and see, to use your eyes to see what's there. Another way to notice would be to experiment with feeling, and that's the interoceptive piece. So if we're experimenting with feeling, one thing we might do is move around a little bit. Just experiment with moving slightly, maybe side to side, could be forward and back. And as you shift, as you move, you might feel these pressure shifts, where you're making contact to the surface underneath you. You might sense some of that pressure shifting, side to side, forward and back. When we begin to experiment with feeling, with interoception, it's always important to notice we don't always feel. It's normal to not always feel. There'll be times when we feel these sensations and times when we don't. And in trauma-sensitive yoga, the experiment is just to notice what we notice. When we feel something, we can notice that. If we don't feel anything, it's okay to notice that too. And just be aware of that as well. Thanks.
Interoception. It's a new word for me, obviously, if I'm barely being able to pronounce it. And when I think of it, from my background, I would think of it as an E-N-T-R-O-ception, as an enteric. But yes, the way it's spelled is with an I. Is that correct? Intero. So how does that relate? Because to me, it's a little different than what I might be accustomed to. And how does this word have meaning to us?
Great. Excellent. First of all, listening to that clip, that is intended to be in a sort of an explanatory clip. If we were doing the practice together, I would have been even much more invitational about it. If you like moving around, possibly feeling. So I just want to point that out for anybody listening, that is really more of an explanatory piece rather than a practice piece. So you may have noticed that. Interoception is really the key Bessel van der Kolk contribution. I would think one of the most important pieces, and it's from neuroscience, and it really refers to our capacity to experience our visceral self, our felt sense of self, our body. So it refers to any organized tissue, skin, muscles, and for yoga teachers, that's kind of our wheelhouse. That's where we operate. So the idea, as it's evolved over the past, say, 15 years or so, is we have brain regions, parts of our brain that transfer this information from our viscera, from our bodies, up through the central nervous system toward the frontal lobe, toward our awareness. And researchers have pretty well established these parts of the brain that are like train stations for that information along the way. Simultaneously, people like van der Kolk and others have sort of hypothesized that traumatized people with complex trauma, their patients, may have some difficulty with interoception. So they started to do some brain scans. And sure enough, it appears as though people with complex interrelational trauma in particular have very dysregulated interoceptive brain regions. And what does that mean? Well, the hypothesis is that we don't get very clear signals from our body. So patients have been telling their therapists for years, I can't feel this part of my body. I feel like I have a giant hole in my stomach. I don't know where I am right now. I can't feel myself in the chair. I don't know where I am right now. So you put that together with, these brain scans, and it seems like one of the wounds, one of the clear wounds of complex trauma is dysregulation to this interoceptive system, our capacity to feel our bodies. And so we wonder at the trauma center if we can help people activate, rejuvenate, in a sense, this interoceptive system through practice. And that's really what it comes down to. Also, from the neuroscience perspective, we know that our brains are plastic now, and that's called neuroplasticity. In other words, we can both grow gray matter in our brains, and we can activate regions of our brains through, focused activities. So we're running with that hypothesis that we can help people really strengthen their interoceptive capacity by practicing yoga in that way.
Interesting. Well, we're going to bring Barbara back on for her observations as a clinician, as well as a yoga teacher, as well as a practitioner. Barbara, what are your thoughts?
Well, to me, this was where everything came together. The things that I was seeing in the clinical room for years, people who dissociated, who basically shut down because what they experienced was so overwhelming, their brain actually did go offline. And I remember attending a training with Bessel where he was showing the brain of someone who was dissociated, and there was basically blank space. There was just nothing there. So understanding that when they said, I don't know where I am, there really was this physical aspect of what was happening, and then that the way in, and you alluded to this before, David, was not top down but bottom up. Feel your feet on the floor. I was doing some version of this years ago when I was helping people ground through their senses when they were spiraling into flashbacks. But this really brought it together, and I think because I'm still this science nerd, even though I'm a yoga teacher, I just love when it all comes together.
Yeah.
And there it is. So it's very exciting to realize that something that sounds so simple, if you don't have complex trauma, and Howie, you are a person who really knows and understands where your body is in space most of the time. But if you don't have that and someone starts to help you learn it, and all of a sudden you feel different, really feel different. Not just, oh, there's some emotion going on. No, I feel my feet on the floor. I'm here.
Yeah. Yes, it's very physical.
Yes.
I agree. Yeah, and there's evidence too, Barbara. I'm totally with you there. And there's evidence from outside of the trauma world, from neurology. People like Antonio Damasio, if your listeners are interested, there's a book called The Feeling of What Happens. A very hardcore neurologist who has this whole hypothesis called the somatic marker hypothesis, which is basically our existence really is grounded in our felt experience in our body. Like we start there, I feel my body in space in this moment. And then we kind of build our, the fact that I'm sitting here talking to you guys or doing whatever, I'm on the beach. I'm on the beach because I can feel the sand under my feet. I can feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. So our existence in a sense as an embodied being is very grounded in physicality. And I think for trauma experts, that piece of people are coming into the office extremely disembodied, and the only tools people had available were very top-down, talk-oriented approach. Like, let's talk about that. Let's see if we can figure that out intellectually. And that wasn't really working for our patients. And so it's like we have to reorient ourselves to starting with the body, and building up our physical experience, and then maybe we can have some conversations, if it's useful.
This makes me wonder, David, if you can talk a little bit about the book you wrote for therapists, because I took a look at that and I was curious about how a therapist who didn't have a yoga practice or wasn't as familiar with yoga might be able to approach the points that you raise in that book. Any comments on that?
mean, sorry.
No, I just said any comments on that.
Any comments? Yeah, no, I think, right. So since we've, the past 15 years or so now, we have some brain research, and along with our experience as a field, suggesting we need to do body work in trauma therapy. And there are some other frameworks out there: sensory motor psychotherapy, somatic experiencing, Peter Levine, the Comey method. There are things like that that have made their way into the therapy office already. Mm-hmm. Trauma sensitive yoga is in that realm. So the idea is trauma informed therapists are already looking for ways to bring the body in to the office, and we feel like we have a very solid, like theoretically solid way to do that. And the idea, we feel like we can teach therapists who maybe aren't yoga teachers how to bring a little bit of this in and add some value for their patients. I mean, Barbara, I'm not sure how you feel about it. For me, I feel to really be able to do this, you have to be practicing it too, and having your own experiences in your body. But for our model, that's at the core anyway, and we call that shared authentic experience. It has to be something that the therapist and their patient or client are doing together. Mm-hmm. So it really requires that,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, David. I would agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's a pretty substantial first half of the show. We've talked about realms for therapists, yoga teachers, and practitioners, or people that are still curious about yoga and haven't practiced yet. It shows that there's much more complexity in any interaction because our words, intentions, and actions can have deep effects. We're going to diverge a little bit from this heavy stuff and move towards a little lighter stuff called the Neomond Minute. Neomond is a deli, caterer, and bakery in Raleigh that is also our sponsor for our show. Neomond has also been our caterer at Yoga Fest, and from reviews, Neomond's lunch is the best thing at Yoga Fest. Oi. Well, it is wonderful. However, there are so many great classes at Yoga Fest, I guess they get diluted out, and Neomond's one giant lunch for hundreds of people. So we're going to divert a little bit to learn about some of the nutritional and taste benefits of Mediterranean cuisine so that your enteric experience can be one of positive and satisfaction.
Hey everybody, this is Chris over at Neomond Mediterranean. Thanks for watching the Neomond Minute. Today I wanted to show you some of our new menu options that are very healthy, very delicious. So I wanted to take you through it. This is Fatouche. This little dynamo has been called a power salad. So many vitamins and minerals in the greens alone. Not to mention all the healthy goodness and all the other veggies in the mix. Our cabbage salad is another strong salad in our health arsenal. It's an anti-inflammatory, great for eye, bone, and brain health as well. You can't say the word salad these days without mentioning our great friend kale. Plenty of calcium, vitamin E, vitamin C, and kale is also loaded with compounds that can help fight off cancer, plus it's delicious. We can't forget our favorite dish of lentils and rice with caramelized onions, known as majadra. Did you know 26% of lentil calories are attributed to protein, which makes them a wonderful source of protein for our vegetarians and vegan friends? And there's nothing this healthy and this delicious that can make even non-vegetarians and vegans ask for second helpings. Well, there you go, everybody. Thanks for watching the Neomond Minute. As you can see, we have a lot of healthy options. We look forward to seeing you. You can come visit us at either location in Raleigh or Morrisville. Reach out to us on the web. We hope to see you soon, and please keep in touch.
What I was curious about from the Neomond Minute and the Majadara was the onions. I often get extra onions, so I abandon the protein and go for the flavor. You can learn more about these Neomon minutes at the neomon.com website, and the scroll down would be under Explore, where all the minutes will be ticking away. You can then also register for their Frequent Foodie program. That's not freaking foodie, it's frequent foodie. Try that 3 times fast without any food in your mouth. Returning to the show. I was
Sounds
getting
good.
hungry.
Getting hungry here.
It's Passover. Come on, we're not eating that stuff. So we're returning to Barbara and Dave and myself occasionally. Less of me is better. And Barbara had a question about some of the books that you had mentioned. So we're going to turn the camera back to Barbara, and she'll ask you to reiterate some of that. Also, teachers, students, and participants, feel free to call 919-518-9773, Computers 2K Voice on Skype, and log in on the chat line box. Thank you, Barbara, for your next thought.
David, I wanted to write down the name of the book you mentioned by the neurologist. You said his name was Masio?
Damasio.
Damasio, okay.
And it's called, there are a few, but one is called The Feeling of What Happens.
Of What Happens, okay.
Yeah, the one that I think for yoga teachers, isn't that a great title?
Mm-hmm.
But he's a neurologist, not a yoga person, not a trauma person. So.
So I have a question for a change. What would be some clear signs that a teacher is having a student in the room that's struggling? Because we ask people to turn inward, and it's not always clear that there's a wall coming up or that it's a permeable membrane and there's receptivity going on as opposed to defense.
Right.
And for students too, what might they observe?
It's a great and really important question. Barbara was talking about dissociation already, and whether or not we want to get too deeply into that, it's a very useful response to surviving complex trauma is to be able to separate parts of ourselves from the experience. So people talk about out-of-body experiences a lot in relation to trauma. I felt like I was floating above the scene, for example. So what happens in yoga classes is very, is a complex mix in that as yoga teachers, we've all seen people cry during yoga forms, for example. We've seen emotional experiences during yoga forms. And it's, I think as teachers in training, most of us are taught to allow space for that in the room, I think the same thing applies here. What I think about is for our students that with complex trauma, they're being triggered, the world is full of triggers, and that's just sights, sounds, smells, physical experiences that kind of kick us back into a trauma response in a way. And we all have different defenses and ways that we respond. Some of us dissociate. Some of us will just get kind of into a fight or flight mode. We may just want to leave the class. A lot of complex trauma people will have maybe potentially more of a freeze response, so they may not be able to leave your class under conditions like that. What I think about for just general yoga teachers is it's probably newer for you than it is for your students. In other words, people are going through the world and having triggered reactions to sensory stimulation. So it's happening all the time. People can survive it. They'll survive. It's newer for you. My general advice to people who don't get training in trauma is you don't need to overreact. I think that's going to be the least helpful thing to do, is to rush in when you see someone freeze or stop doing the flow of the class, or maybe even cry. Most of the time is just to let it be. People can ride that flow themselves. In fact, they really don't want that intervention a lot of time. If they're coming to a public yoga class, they don't want to be I identified as somebody with complex trauma. I mean, they're making a choice to be there, and they can manage it.
Mm.
That's why I think that, Howie, the more important point, I think, is for yoga teachers is to be really careful about saying that you're doing yoga for trauma if you don't have significant training underneath it, because then people will come to you with a purpose to treat their trauma, and then you have much more responsibility at that point. So if you say you're doing yoga for trauma, you have the obligation to understand what that means with significant depth, so you can be, you can provide ethical service to people.
Fascinating. Well, we have another pearl of wisdom from David in guiding our viewers to developing a practice that may help mitigate some of the trauma that you may have experienced, or for teachers to share with their students. Thank you, Adnan.
Hi. In this short video clip, we could experiment with a choice-making practice. And one way to do that might be to use some shoulder rolls. So one way to move your shoulders, you could experiment if you want with making circles. And just notice that you could make the circles either forward or backward. So the circles can move either forward or backward. And that just gives you some choice. You can go in one direction the whole time, or you could switch. You could experiment with switching. And as you move, you may notice some feeling around your shoulders. So one choice here is the direction that you move your shoulders. And you can experiment with that. It could be one direction, or you could switch a couple of times. Another possibility is that you're in charge of the size of the movements. So you can make these movements smaller or bigger. And again, that just provides more opportunity for choices. You can make very small movements, you can make bigger gestures. Sometimes we know what we want to do, and we could just do that. We could make our choice based on the fact that we might know what we want to do. Sometimes we don't know, and in that case, one possibility is to notice how it feels. So the different size movements might feel different. Smaller movements might feel different than bigger movements to you and your body. And maybe allowing that sensation to help you choose what you want to do. So there's a couple of connections with happening there. One is that you are in charge of the size of the movement. You can experiment there. Another piece of that is the size of the movement you make might feel different in your body. It might feel different. So you can experiment with noticing sensation. Then possibly how that feels to you might help you choose what you want to do. And the choices like you and I make might be different. We can make different choices about how we're moving here. And just experimenting, maybe a little bit of shoulder circles. And then whenever you're ready, just bringing that short choice-making practice to an end. Thanks.
Thank you. Barbara had some questions, so let's switch over to her.
Yeah, I'm not even sure it's a question. It's just an observation of how simple the words are in some ways, but how powerful, right? That all of what you brought in there, the choice is yours. We get to do this differently. And that last piece of maybe you get to make a choice based on how something feels to you. I mean, it's operating on many levels, but I love the simplicity of that and all of the normalizing you're doing. Your experience might be different than mine, and just this idea of making these simple choices that we know can have ramifications, as we like to say, off the mat. Wow, I can choose how to move my body. It's big stuff to someone who's been through what folks with complex trauma have been through.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's at the heart of it. Again, who's in charge of this body? So like traumatic relationships teach us that we don't have control. I mean, it's a fundamental part of the sort of the trauma dynamic is someone else is in charge. And so the healing process has to engage this sort of shift, where we get to be in charge again. And we've had students, say to us, this is the first time. I mean, many of our students came into the world, and their core trauma started, at day one. So being in charge and learning how to have agency, I can control what I'm doing with my body, is a very serious project, and it's right there. It's right in the middle of it. So yeah, we try to use forms. So for yoga teachers, I don't know how that sounds sometimes. I was taught to be very directive as a yoga teacher, and I think a lot of us are. Every form has all this potential for choice making, but the yoga teacher has to be able to tolerate some space for that. Like everybody may do this a little differently. Is that okay with me?
Well, and I think that's at the very heart of accessible yoga. Certainly, if you look at some of the populations that Howie and the other, you call this yoga ambassador teachers, are teaching to, their versions of the traditional poses look very, very different. So it's wonderful to be inclusive in that way. And also, I think you cannot say this enough. I teach restorative yoga, and I'm always telling people or reminding them, if something is uncomfortable, feel free to come out of the pose. You can make these changes anytime along the way. And still, after class, someone will come up and say, I was staying in child's pose for a really long time, and my feet got numb. Yeah. So you cannot say this enough. It takes a long time, even for those who are not dealing with complex trauma, to feel like it's okay to do something different sometimes. Messages go really deeply into us. Yeah.
Totally. And you add to that the core learning of trauma is, in order to survive, you better figure out what that other person wants. And you need to do what they want. And so folks will be really trying to parse your language. And, he's giving invitations, but what does Dave really want from me? That's what I need to figure out. So it takes a long time, and it's, to feel safe enough to make a choice for yourself. But we want to try to make opportunities available for that as much as we can,
I have a thought, question, comment from my own personal experience with trauma. My traumas, as I mentioned, don't usually involve or haven't involved a second person directly assaulting me. I might have collided with someone, or I could have been involved, but no one assaulted me. And what I noticed the other day is when I was watching the hockey game, and someone collided with the goalie and looked like he leveled the goalie, and the goalie was writhing on the ice, and I just became ill because it connected to when I had a collision, got knocked out, was paralyzed from the neck down, and when I woke up, and I was internally screaming at myself to move, but just all the fear and the emotional trauma has been packed away. For maybe I'm in the majority, I just sort of stuffed it away and said it was only a flesh wound and moved on. But for years, it's definitely embedded in my body, and it was just very interesting to see someone else have an experience, and it was the most impacted by my experience, which was over 10 years ago. And as the book by Dr. Van de Kolk says, the body keeps the score.
Right.
And apparently I hadn't let the score out yet uh, sufficiently to see something and to have such an somatic response and an emotional response. It was more than I was used to.
Yeah.
So I wonder your thought, and we're going to go to a pearl first, and hopefully this will cue in, but I'll invite the listeners and yourself to offer a distinction as to what might be a self-induced or non-human initiated, second human initiated versus an offender who is actually gone. Is there ways to distinguish trauma, or is trauma just trauma? And uh, I'm just lucky to not have verbal cues or something that might initiate that. So we're going to put a hold on that and to think about distinctions of sources of trauma and come to David's pearl that may help us settle while our shoulders are still swirling.
Hi there. For this short practice, we could experiment with something we call taking effective action. And this is basically combining interoception and choice making. So, for example, for this one, we might want to experiment with a twist, a turning kind of action. And here's a way to do a twist with this taking effective action kind of sensibility. First of all, if you like, whether you're sitting or standing, you could try turning one direction. And the turning action itself is something that you're in charge of. In other words, how much you turn, for example, that's something that you're in charge of. You can choose. You might want to turn just a little bit. You may want to turn to a different degree. That's really up to you. It's your choice. So there we have that choice-making potentiality. And you can switch sides whenever you want. So there's choice-making inside of a yoga form, in this case turning. How much you want to turn, how much I want to turn. That's something that we're each in charge of, and we can choose. Here's the interoception piece and how we can move toward taking effective action. If you're turning, you may discover that turning different amounts feels different in your body. It might feel different depending on how much you turn. Where? Well, you could notice sensation, for example, maybe in your back or around your ribs. You might feel something else. But the investigation here could be how much you turn, the degree to which you turn. It might feel different depending on how much you turn. That's interoception. What does it feel like? There's another piece, which is the feeling might change depending on the choice you make. How far, to what degree you want to turn. Here's taking effective action. One way to decide what you want to do, to choose, may be to notice the different feeling, different sensation, and choose what you want to feel in your body in this moment. So you may discover the feeling changes, the sensation, depending on how much you turn. You might use that information, that sensory information, to help you decide what you want to do, how much you want to turn. And this is totally personal and subjective. You're using this information from your body experience right now to help you decide how much you want to turn.
All right, well, we're turning back to David and considering that there's levels of complexity, as Barbara was explaining during the video. I had my own form of PTSD, and though it may be a capital T in that qualitative experience, that there's also some other little t in there, and that I'm maybe upset with myself. Any thoughts about that, Dave?
I mean, it's a great point, Howie. I think, first of all, there's the subjective nature of trauma. Many of us, we can all have the same experience and respond differently. And by the way, I always like to say it doesn't mean it's not better or worse to respond to these events with trauma, with, getting symptoms for PTSD or not. It doesn't mean we're weaker or stronger. One of the things that really drives me crazy in our culture is some implications that becoming traumatized, getting PTSD, is a weakness in some way. And I want to just refute that entirely. It's not the case. However, there is a subjective quality to it, and we're all going to respond differently. One of the things I would say is context matters from all the research over the years. In other words, human beings that are born into chronically abusive or neglectful environments, homes, are invariably impacted the most intensely by these experiences. So there's a context issue, and then there's a varying degree. It's a very dangerous thing for a person to be born into chronic abuse or neglect. And then you can draw that out over the lifespan. Thinking about your example of the hockey game, there's context there. It's a violent sport. Bodies are smashing into each other constantly. And so there's some context that's a little bit different than these people are supposed to be caring for me. These people are supposed to be nurturing me, keeping me safe in this world, and they're not. In fact, they're doing the opposite. That's not to say that we don't have a very violent culture, where we're very war-oriented, we're very aggressive and violent, and that has an impact on us, for sure. But there's some contextual differences there and subjective differences that are all totally that are real and valid and complex. So your experience is totally valid. It's completely valid.
Well, thank you for that perspective. We're going to be winding down a little bit, but I'm going to ask Barbara if she has other thoughts about what we're touching on here. Also, that choice option or taking action with the interoceptive and the twisting. Any other fine little tips about that, Barbara or Dave? Barbara first.
Well, again, I thought it was another example of how the subtle is so powerful. It's subtle, yet it's strong to say you can choose and you can take action on your own behalf. That freeze response that's so predominant for folks. I had a different question, really, which is I'm wondering, David, if you can talk about the training that's available for yoga teachers who are interested in learning more about this. I thought your point was really powerful about the ethics involved in, if you say you're doing this, you really need to understand the depth of trauma and really know what you're doing. So can you tell us a little bit about the training that's available at Trauma Center?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think the first issue is how informed does one want to be as a yoga teacher? I think it would be great if all yoga trainings had a module on trauma, because trauma is so prevalent in our world. That yoga teachers had some exposure to trauma. Then it's going to be a matter of how much do you want to know, because then you're going to have to respond. So we have a whole range of things. I mean, we have books that are just, give some information to 1-day trainings, 2-day trainings, 4 and 5-day, and then we have a 300-hour certification program. So I guess what the distinction there is, at the moment, we're just talking about yoga teachers. If you're teaching yoga classes, you will have traumatized people in your classes. And then the question is, how do you want to respond to them when they come in the door? Do you want to provide a safe space? We can call it a trauma-informed space. Or do you want to teach yoga in whatever way you've learned? I think at the very least, we probably owe our students that clarity. For example, this class there will be a command-oriented approach to it. And the focus will be on alignment, and there will be physical assists, for sure. We will touch you in this class. Sometimes we'll ask, sometimes we won't. we should tell people that so that they can choose whether or not they want to expose themselves to that. You know, these are all issues related to trauma. And I think, at least for us at the Trauma Center, we have an array of training that yoga teachers can get involved in to the degree that they're interested, you know.
Wow. And David, is there preferred contact information and anything coming up in North Carolina?
Easiest way to get the information is traumasensitiveyoga.com. We just compiled all our stuff there. And yes, Howie, I get to visit. I've been fortunate to visit North Carolina, Wilmington since 2011. I think we figured was the first year. And I'll be back there again the last weekend in April. So Friday evening, Saturday, Sunday, and I love spending time down there.
It's a beautiful time of year. No one should leave North Carolina in April. It's it's the peak season for us here. So it's great that you're coming down. And we appreciate all that you're sharing. Any other thoughts, comments that you'd like to share before we wrap up and talk about next week's show?
No, thanks a lot for this really rich discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Well, it's an honor that you're available and willing to speak with us and our audience. Viewers, listeners, feel free to write to us at You Call This Yoga via our website. If you have questions that are outside of the show. Coming up next week, we also have Carrington Jackson from Blue Lotus Yoga in Raleigh, as well as her participation in the Off the Mat program that brings yoga around the world. Carson was just in the Middle East. Carrington was in the Middle East recently, and will share some of her experiences there too. We look forward to seeing you next week at 10 o'clock. We look to be weekly now at this time. It's great to be back on the air. We're in great appreciation of David as well as Barbara, our co-host today. Thank you, Barbara.
Oh, thanks for being here, David. It's lovely to speak with you. I so appreciate the work you're doing. Oh, thank you.
Same here. Thanks, guys.
And a final thank you to our sponsor, Neomond, who brings you delicious food, excellent cuisine, and enhancement to your health. See you soon. Namaste.
You're tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section on nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Atomos.com, makers of quality video recorders and converters, CarolinaApparel.com, and DeltaForce.net.